You're living inside a system you didn't choose. And the terrifying part? It's following a script written thousands of years ago. Rome, Persia, the Mongols, Britain, the Ottomans, Spain. Different languages, different cultures, different centuries, different continents. But when you place them side by side, something appears that shouldn't be there. Not coincidence, not mythology, not accidents of history. A pattern, precise, deliberate, repeating. And once you see it, every news headline starts to make sense in a way that should disturb you, because it's still running right now. Empires don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with declarations of conquest or imperial flags. They arrive when everything around you is falling apart. Fractured regions, competing powers, weak borders, economic pressure, political chaos, failed states, power vacuums. And while you're focused on the crisis, something else is moving into position. Because the first stage isn't conquest, it's something you'll actually defend. Watch how this works. When Julius Caesar crossed into Gaul, he didn't call it invasion, he called it protection. The Helvetii were migrating, Germanic tribes were crossing the Rhine, Roman allies needed defending, your borders need securing. Every step justified, every expansion defensive. By the time those protective operations ended, Rome had absorbed enormous territory, millions of people, and wealth beyond measure. But here's what makes your skin crawl. Nobody called it conquest until it was too late. The Mongols perfected this into an art form. Genghis Khan started by unifying fractured steppe tribes, ending internal conflict, creating order from chaos. Sound familiar? When Mongol envoys were killed by neighboring kingdoms, retaliation followed. Diplomatic insult, broken alliances, violated agreements. Each justification opened another door. Each defensive war led to permanent control. By the time Europe understood what was happening, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe. Not through random violence, through justified responses. Britain took this to corporate precision. They didn't arrive in India claiming empire. They arrived as traders, just business, just commerce, just protecting trade routes. Then military protection became necessary, then political influence, then administrative control, then direct rule. The East India Company started as a business. Within decades, it had private armies, vast territories, taxation power, and the authority to wage war. By the 19th century, Britain ruled a quarter of humanity. And here's what should concern you about right now. This is the first stage, expansion disguised as stability. You don't take, you respond, you intervene, you protect, you stabilize. And the narrative feels so justified that resistance comes late, often too late. But here's where it gets more sophisticated, because conquest alone doesn't build lasting empires. Plenty of kingdoms conquered land and vanished within a generation. What separated temporary powers from centuries of dominance was something you depend on every single day. The invisible cage you call convenience. Not just territory, not borders, not military force. Control of flow, of resources, of goods, of people, of information, of money. Rome understood this before almost anyone. They built infrastructure on a scale the ancient world had never seen, over 250,000 miles of roads at their peak, connecting Europe, North Africa, the Middle East. But these weren't just roads for soldiers, they were arteries of dependency. Grain shipments from Egypt feeding 1 million people in Rome, trade goods from Asia moving west, tax revenue from provinces flowing to the capital, messages traveling faster than ever before in human history. Everything moved through Roman networks. And here's the trap they built. Provincial cities depended on Roman roads for trade. Merchants depended on Roman law for contracts. Soldiers depended on Roman logistics for supply. Remove Rome from the system, and the entire system collapsed. That's not conquest, that's something far more permanent. The Mongols adapted this brilliantly to their geography. They didn't build roads, they secured the Silk Road, made it safe for the first time in centuries. Merchants got protection under Mongol law. Trade caravans got safe passage. The Yam postal system could deliver messages from Beijing to Eastern Europe in weeks. For the first time in history, East and West were connected under one political structure. Trade exploded. Silk, spices, precious metals, knowledge, technology. and the Mongols taxed everything, every transaction, every movement, every exchange. They didn't need to control every city, they controlled the flow between them. Britain industrialized this principle into something you'd recognize today. They didn't just control routes, they controlled industries, production, processing, distribution, finance. Tea from China and India, textiles from South Asia, rubber from Malaya, cotton from Egypt. British shipping lanes dominated the oceans. British banks financed international trade. British insurance companies protected merchant vessels. British legal systems governed global contracts. London became the financial center of the world. The pound became the global reserve currency. Greenwich Mean Time became the standard for planetary coordination. Britain didn't rule through soldiers alone. They ruled through systems, through infrastructure that made the world dependent on British institutions. And here's what you need to understand about your life right now. This is the second stage. Control the flow. Not just land, not just people, but the systems people depend on to survive. Food supply, trade networks, energy sources, financial pipelines, communication systems, legal frameworks. The empire that controls flow doesn't need to control you directly, because you can't escape dependency on systems you need to live. But power creates enemies, expansion creates fear, control creates resentment. So how do you maintain stability across millions of people who have every reason to rebel?
The loyalty trap that feels like freedom. You don't rely on violence. Violence is expensive. Occupation requires endless resources. You do something more elegant, more permanent. You engineer cooperation. Rome mastered this with surgical precision. They didn't treat every conquered person the same. They created hierarchies, gradations of status, paths to advancement. They rewarded local elites, tribal leaders, wealthy merchants, influential families, anyone with existing power. Citizenship offered legal rights, property protection, social mobility, access to Roman courts, protection from arbitrary punishment. Once you benefited from Roman status, rebellion became self-destruction. Why overthrow a system that elevated you? Why fight an empire that made you powerful? This created a class of local collaborators who enforced Roman rule more effectively than any occupying army. They had local knowledge, cultural understanding, social networks, and they had skin in the game. Their wealth depended on stability. Their status depended on Roman authority. Their future depended on the empire's success. The Mongols refined this with brutal efficiency. Conquered leaders weren't always executed. Many were integrated, given land, administrative authority, economic incentives, allowed to keep their titles, wealth, and local power. As long as they swore loyalty, paid tribute, provided soldiers, they became part of the imperial structure. Their survival depended on Mongol success, so they enforced Mongol rule themselves, collected taxes, maintained order, suppressed rebellion. Resistance was crushed as a warning. Cooperation was rewarded as an incentive. Britain turned this into an art form. In India, Africa, the Middle East, they kept traditional rulers in place, local princes, regional authorities, maharajas, sultans, chiefs. As long as loyalty remained, power and wealth remained. Britain didn't need massive occupying forces everywhere. Local elites managed populations on their behalf. Lower costs, less resistance, the appearance of local governance with ultimate control maintained. This is the third stage, and you're living in a version of it right now. Make loyalty profitable. Make rebellion expensive. Give people something to lose. Create intermediaries whose interests align with imperial interests, because systems built on dependency enforce themselves. Fear requires constant enforcement. Dependency is automatic. The pattern that predicts collapse. Now you can see it. The blueprint reveals itself. Expansion through justification, control through resource flow, stability through loyalty engineering. 3 stages, 3 mechanisms, each reinforcing the others. Expansion creates access to resources. Resource control creates dependency. Dependency creates loyal intermediaries. Loyal intermediaries enable further expansion. A self-reinforcing cycle tested across millennia. But here's what history teachers won't tell you. The blueprint contains its own destruction mechanism built into the design. Every empire reaches limits, physical limits, economic limits, organizational limits. Growth slows, costs rise, internal contradictions multiply. Watch what happened to Rome. Expansion required constant military spending. Defending increasingly long borders drained resources. Maintaining legions across 3 continents became unbearable. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Veterans expected land grants. The bureaucracy grew massive. Taxes increased to cover costs. Inflation eroded currency. Trade imbalances created debt. Political competition intensified. Generals fought for power using loyal legions. Emperors were assassinated. Civil wars destroyed infrastructure. The roads that connected the empire became battlegrounds. The loyalty system weakened. Citizenship lost value. Trust in central authority eroded. Rome didn't collapse overnight. It fractured under its own weight. The Mongols fell even faster. Succession disputes erupted after Genghis Khan's death. Who would lead? Which son? Which grandson? The empire split into competing khanates, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, the Yuan dynasty. Trade routes became contested, unity disappeared, cooperation turned to rivalry. The largest land empire in history collapsed within generations, not from external invasion, from internal rivalry. Britain followed the same trajectory. 2 world wars drained the economy. Colonial administration became impossibly expensive. Global competition increased. The colonies that generated wealth became liabilities. Independence movements gained momentum. Maintaining control cost more than it produced. The empire dissolved, not through battlefield defeat, through financial exhaustion. And here's what should keep you up at night. This isn't coincidence. It's structural, mathematical, inevitable. The blueprint contains failure mechanisms. Expansion creates overextension. Distant borders are expensive to defend. Control becomes tenuous. Resource control creates exploitation. Extraction creates resentment. Inequality breeds resistance. Loyalty systems create entrenched elites who resist reform. The system ossifies. Eventually, costs exceed benefits. The center cannot hold. The periphery breaks away. The forces that built the empire tear it apart. Empires don't fall to outside enemies, not primarily. They fall to internal pressure, economic strain, political fragmentation, social unrest, administrative overload, loss of legitimacy. External threats just accelerate what's already happening inside.
Now here's the part that makes this urgent. The blueprint didn't disappear. It adapted. Modern power doesn't rely on territorial conquest. That became too expensive, too visible, too condemned. It relies on something harder to see, harder to resist. Resources aren't controlled through colonies anymore. They're controlled through supply chains that run through specific choke points, currency dominance that forces global transactions through particular systems, energy markets controlled by cartels, corporate networks that span borders, debt structures that create lasting obligations, technology platforms that control information flow. Loyalty isn't created through citizenship anymore. It's created through debt that creates dependency, trade relationships that make resistance economically devastating, foreign investment that gives external powers leverage over your domestic policy, access to global markets controlled by international institutions, military protection that creates security dependencies, technology access that creates developmental dependencies. Different tools, same structure. Look at modern expansion. It doesn't arrive with armies first. It arrives with advisors, economic development agreements, security partnerships, infrastructure investment, loans and grants, technical assistance. Influence expands quietly. Borders stay the same on maps. Control does not. A country maintains sovereignty in name, but policy follows external recommendations. Resources flow according to international agreements. Development follows external investment priorities. Look at modern resource dominance. Energy markets dictate geopolitics. Countries that control oil, natural gas, rare earth minerals wield disproportionate power. Shipping lanes determine global trade. A few strategic choke points carry the majority of global commerce. Technology platforms control information flow.
A handful of companies determine what billions see, read, believe. Algorithm changes shift public opinion. Platform policies shape discourse. Financial infrastructure routes global transactions through specific systems, SWIFT, the dollar, international banking networks. Control these systems, control global commerce. Look at modern loyalty structures. Countries depend on trade access. Losing major markets means economic collapse, so they align policy with market requirements. Corporations depend on regulatory approval, so they align with political priorities in key markets. Governments depend on foreign capital, investment, loans, bond purchases, so they maintain policies that keep capital flowing. Cooperation is rewarded: investment, trade access, technology transfer, diplomatic support. Resistance is punished: sanctions, tariffs, divestment, credit downgrades, market exclusion. No armies needed. Economic pressure is cleaner, more deniable, harder to resist. The methods changed, the logic did not.
This isn't ancient history. This is about you, right now. The trade networks you depend on for food, goods, technology, the currencies you use, the political structures you trust, the corporations that shape your daily life, the financial systems that enable or constrain your possibilities. They're not random, not natural, not inevitable. They're part of a structure refined over thousands of years, tested, optimized, perfected. A blueprint that builds empires, creates power, controls populations, that also, inevitably, contains the seeds of its own destruction. Now that you see the blueprint, now that you understand the pattern, the question isn't whether it exists, the question is where you are inside it. Are we in expansion, control, loyalty? Or are we in the pressure phase, the strain phase, the moment before transformation? Because what happens when expansion stops working, when growth ends and pressure begins, when loyalty weakens and systems strain, when power starts protecting itself instead of expanding, that's the moment the blueprint reveals its final truth. And every signal suggests that moment isn't coming, it's here. Because power doesn't collapse from enemies, it collapses from what comes after growth, from the internal contradictions that growth creates, from the pressures that success generates, from the mathematical inevitability built into the blueprint itself. The expansion phase created the dependencies you live with. The control phase built the systems you can't escape. The loyalty phase determined which side of the hierarchy you're on. And the pressure phase? That's already begun. The only question left is whether you'll recognize what's happening before the pattern completes itself again. So where are we in the cycle? Where are you in the blueprint? Every empire reaches a middle phase, not rising rapidly, not collapsing yet. Stretching, where expansion slows because easy gains are exhausted, where costs increase because systems become complex and inefficient, where internal tensions rise because inequality grows and legitimacy fades. The pressure phase. Systems look stable on the surface, infrastructure still functions, trade still flows, power still projects, but pressure builds underneath, stress accumulates, cracks form. Rome experienced this during the crisis of the 3rd century, the Tetrarchy, the division into East and West, decades of instability masked by periods of recovery. The Mongols experienced it during fragmentation. The Khanates still existed, trade still moved, but unity was gone. Britain experienced it during post-war decline. The empire still existed on maps, but economics had shifted, costs had become unbearable. And modern systems show similar stress signals right now. Economic instability, recurring crises, debt levels that can't be sustained, inequality at historic extremes, political polarization, trust in institutions collapsing, inability to address systemic problems, gridlock, resource competition intensifying, energy transitions creating winners and losers, water scarcity, food security concerns, institutional strain, international organizations losing effectiveness, treaties ignored, norms violated, the rules-based order fragmenting. The signs repeat, the pattern continues.
If the blueprint always produces the same outcome, what happens next? The truth about collapse. Collapse doesn't mean destruction, not for everyone. It means transformation. Old systems fall, new structures emerge, new power centers rise, new empires form. Different names, same pattern. After Rome fell, new powers emerged: Byzantium, the Islamic Caliphates, the Carolingian Empire. After the Mongols fragmented, new empires rose: the Ottomans, the Mongols, Ming China, the Russian Empire. After European colonial empires dissolved, new power structures emerged: superpowers, economic blocs, international institutions, multinational corporations. The blueprint continues under new management. And here's what most people miss. The people at the top rarely fear collapse, not the way you do, because collapse creates opportunity for those positioned correctly, for those who understand the pattern, for those with resources and knowledge. Assets get redistributed during collapse, but they don't disappear. They change hands. Fire sales create bargains. Chaos creates opportunities. Influence shifts during transitions. Old power structures weaken. New ones form. Those who adapt quickly gain disproportionate positions in the new order. New systems are built on the ruins of old ones, and those who build the new systems shape them to their advantage. For those who understand the blueprint, collapse isn't an ending. It's a reset, a reordering, a chance to restructure the game. So the blueprint continues, generation after generation. Expansion, control, loyalty, strain, collapse, reconstruction. Over and over. The actors change, the tools evolve, the pattern remains.